I feel this is the most dangerous phase in my life. He's planning an accident in my car, brake failure and serious head injury, in order to make the path.
In October 1996, Princess Diana predicted her own death in this letter to her butler, Paul Burrell. 2 weeks ago, he released the letter, blanking out the name of the person Diana believed was plotting her murder.
The problem that the establishment will have is that they have covered up the inquest, never been an inquest. They have not allowed a public inquiry into what happened to Diana in this country. And that has fueled already conspiracy theories for the last 6 years. And what today's letter will do is simply give credence to the view that there was more to it than meets the eye, and we should have some form of formal investigation.
There was an official French inquiry into the deaths of Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed, an inquiry that ruled out foul play. But 6 years on, there's still been no inquest in Britain. The Coroner's Act states there has to be an inquest if bodies are brought back here for burial, and that is what happened on August the 31st, 1997. The Act says the inquest has to be held as soon as practicable. The Tatler is the magazine of the rich and chic. It's close to the establishment, but its editor is now leading a campaign for that inquest.
Why has the most famous woman, possibly in the 20th century, who died in mysterious circumstances, not have what she's legally entitled to, which is an inquest? I mean, it is an obligation under the law. It's not a nicety. It's not something which we might feel was polite or decent to do. It is a legal obligation.
At 20 minutes past midnight on the 31st of August 1997, Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed set out from the Ritz Hotel in central Paris. And of the 4 people in her Mercedes, only the bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones, would survive. 2 hours after the crash, French police arrested 7 paparazzi for manslaughter. Their high-speed chase had caused the deaths. 30 hours later, the French authorities changed the story dramatically. Now the fault was the drivers. Henri Paul was drunk and on medication. Following a French government inquiry in 1999, this explanation remains the official cause of the accident and the deaths of Diana, Dodi, and their driver. But now we know that the official version is deeply flawed.
The investigating magistrate and the prosecution wanted to come to an end because there was too much pressure, because no one would know the real truth anyway, so it had to be stopped. So it was stopped, and of course, not everything has been inquired on.
We've been allowed to film the 27 volumes of confidential evidence the French inquiry gathered. None of these documents have been seen before. The files raise a number of very worrying questions about the inquiry. Why was the scene of the accident scrubbed clean and opened within 4 hours of the crash, destroying valuable forensic evidence? Why was the traffic police investigation not included in the official inquiry report? Why was the first witness on the scene ignored and silenced by the police? Why was the autopsy carried out on Henri Paul so blatantly inaccurate? And why were the Secret Service connections of both Henri Paul and another key witness never properly explored? One of our discoveries was this photograph of the Mercedes and its occupants taken just seconds before the crash. Many vital questions have never been properly pursued, let alone answered. And that appears to be no accident. In July 1997, Princess Diana and her children spent 2 weeks in Saint-Tropez as guests of the Al-Fayeds. She was a free woman, just divorced and just out of a 2-year love affair. Three weeks later, Diana went back, without her children, to join the Al Fayed family on their new £12 million yacht, the Johnny Cal. During the cruise, Diana made very public her new romance with Dodi Al Fayed. The couple gave great headlines. Princess of the Paradox Diana yo-yoed between posing for stills and pleading for privacy. On Saturday the 30th of August, Diana, Dodi and bodyguard Trevor Rees-Jones flew by private plane from Sardinia, where the Johnny Cal had moored. They were bound for Paris, where they were met at the airport by paparazzi, including photographer Fabrice Chasserie. His pictures caught a moment in history.
Là, on voit Trevor et Keith Winfield qui descendent de l'avion avec des bagages.
The first time the four people who would drive in the doomed Mercedes ever met.
Là, nous, à ce moment-là, on était à peu près vers au niveau de la douane. Pareil. Là, on aperçoit Henri Paul.
Dodi was close to Henri Paul, deputy head of security at the Ritz. He is one of the key personalities of the night and a man with a complicated past.
Henri Paul, who was the second in charge of security at the Ritz Hotel and was sort of press-ganged into being the chauffeur that night at the last minute, he was a long-standing agent for MI6, an agent in terms of supplying information to MI6 about the goings-on in the Ritz Hotel in return for cash. And he'd been working for MI6 since, well, I'd seen his file for the first time in 1992, and from memory he'd been working for MI6 for a few years prior to that.
The Secret Service connection was confirmed by Henri Paul's best friend, Claude Garec.
Moi, j'ai toujours su qu'il avait des rapports avec les services secrets, mais dans le cadre de son travail. Pas dans un cadre d'aller trahir qui que ce soit, ou de monter des opérations à son compte. C'est complètement, encore une fois, fantaisiste.
C'est ça, c'est le fait qu'il occupe cette fonction dans cet hôtel qui l'a mis en rapport.
Évidemment.
Et anglais?
Mais anglais, de tout, je veux dire...
Tout type de service secret.
Arabe, israélien, tout ce que vous voulez. Je veux dire, à partir du moment où cet hôtel-là n'a pas spécialement une clientèle plutôt qu'une autre.
The inquiry faced a politically sensitive issue, deciding how much of Henri Paul's past it could reveal. And this was not the only difficult decision. Henri Paul accompanied Diana and Dodi to the Villa Windsor, the mansion Edward VIII and Mrs. Simpson had lived in Paris, a property the Al Fayed family had bought.
I think she was aware that she was a potential Duchess of Windsor, a sort of loose cannon who they were going to watch very carefully, and she was not averse to upsetting them, and I think she quite enjoyed how much the affair with Dodi would upset everybody back at Buckingham Palace, as indeed it did, and a bit of in-your-faceness was in her nature.
They drove to Dodi's flat. Number 1 Rue Arsène Osé, near the Étoile. Dodi had booked a table at a smart Parisian restaurant, but at 9:45, he cancelled because there was a crowd outside. Diana and Dodi returned to the Ritz, the great hotel owned by Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed. The couple ate in the restaurant. She had sole, he had turbot, and then they went up to the £6,000 a night Imperial Suite. Previous occupants included Hermann Goering, Winston Churchill, and Woody Allen. Henri Paul left work at 7 p.m. 2 hours later, he was asked to return to the Ritz. Henri Paul's ultimate boss at the Ritz is also the owner of Harrods in London. Mohammed Al-Fayed still ponders what happened that night.
Dodi called me. It was about 12 o'clock. He said, I'm going now to the apartment. And he told me, it's a lot of paparazzi. I don't know what they do. The Place Vendôme is full of people. I told him, please, it's so dangerous. Just stay in a hotel. Everything is there. No need for you to go out. He told me, I think I will follow your advice. Why? After Dodi assured me that he's not going to go out. Henry Paul gone to him at 12 o'clock after Dodi talking to me and convinced him, no problem, we're going to go from the back entrance. Everything is okay. Don't worry, I know the way. And please, because you have already prepared everything there, change Dodi's mind. Dodi followed him up. And he said, because all the arrangements there, they have the champagne, they have the party there in the apartment.
Henri Paul, part-time MI6 man, would help Dodi devise a plan to outwit the paparazzi. This amateur video is the only record of what was happening outside at the front of the Ritz.
Someone's out, they're very important.
Tourists and paparazzi wait for the glamorous couple. Henri Paul tells the crowd the couple will be leaving soon in this, their Mercedes. 5 minutes later, the clever ploy, a second Mercedes pulls up by the back door of the Ritz. Henri Paul, Princess Diana, Dodi, and Trevor Rees-Jones get in. Paul takes the wheel. Meanwhile, at the front of the Ritz, people scramble into their cars, realizing they've been fooled. Using two Mercedes might not be vintage James Bond, but it gave Diana and Dodi's car a head start.
Chasing Princess Diana!
The quickest way from the Ritz to Dodi's flat was up the Champs-Élysées, but at the Concorde, the car turned left instead of right. It then raced along the riverbank of the Seine. It was now actually going away from Dodi's flat. But the French inquiry never asked why they were taking this route.
It is a mystery why they were where they were, because there are many different ways of getting to the apartment that they were going to at the top of the Champs-Élysées without going via the Champs-Élysées. Where they were, it's inexplicable.
Our access to the files reveals that most witnesses did not see the actual crash because they were either at the entrance or the exit of the tunnel. It's amazing that one crucial witness who was behind the Mercedes was ignored by the inquiry. His name is Eric Patel.
Non, je commence à rentrer dans le tournant. Là, il y a des appels de bar. Parce que la voiture, bon, c'est vrai qu'elle roule assez vite quand même. J'avais pas conscience, quoi. Et j'entends comme, à un moment où elle arrive à ma hauteur, j'entends comme une implosion. Et malgré mon pot d'échappement qui avait trafiqué ce que je vous racontais, j'ai entendu cette implosion.
Patel was not the only person to hear a strange noise.
Clive Gura Voodoo, who was on the bridge above the Alma Tunnel, he and also was a chauffeur, and his car was parked, and he was waiting for the people he was waiting for to come out of their restaurant or cinema or something, and he was having a cigarette on the bridge over the Alma Tunnel, and he heard this car coming towards him, and he heard a very loud noise, and his conclusion, I think, was that the person driving that car had actually engaged neutral and then pressed the accelerator. That was the sound of a racing engine, not in gear, which he described.
Et comme je venais d'avoir ma moto, je croyais que c'était la mienne. Donc qu'est-ce que je fais? Je ralentis, je regarde si c'est ma moto qui déconne ou etc. Et à ce moment-là, j'entends un grand boom. C'est la voiture qui s'était éclatée contre le poteau avant.
Henri Paul and Dodi Al-Fayed died almost instantly.
Et donc je prends la personne qui est à l'arrière, donc pas sur le siège, mais côté qui est affalé contre le passager arrière, qui est accroupi sur le passager, sur le dossier du passager avant, au sol, et je la prends pour la mettre en arrière. Et à ce moment-là, la tête me tombe en arrière. Et je vois du sang qui coulait de son oreille et du nez. Et sur le coup, c'est marrant, je me suis dit, mais je connais cette personne.
Patel went to this phone box and rang the emergency services. Then he went to the nearest police station. He was badly shaken.
Je me souviens, il y avait pilier de dossiers d'information, vous savez, pour les papiers, etc. Et je les prends, je les jette. Et lui, le réflexe qu'il a, c'est qu'il appelle d'autres personnes pour essayer de me calmer. Mais plus on essayait de me calmer, plus je m'énervais parce que je me disais, mais merde, faites quelque chose. Et eux, ce qu'ils ont fait, ils m'ont maîtrisé. Ils m'ont mis les menottes et ils m'ont mis dans un bureau. Attendez, on va chercher l'inspecteur qui s'occupe de ça. Et voilà.
Princess Diana was very badly hurt when she hit the back of Trevor Rees-Jones's seat, but she was not trapped in the metal. Under a flash, the full damage is clear. At 20 to 1 in the morning, Paris Chief Constable Pierre Massonny was told of the crash. He woke his boss, the Minister of the Interior, and then made for the tunnel. Princess Diana was lifted out and put in one of the 3 ambulances that had arrived by 12:40. By 2 a.m., Police Chief Massonny and the French Minister of the Interior became worried because Diana's ambulance had still not reached the hospital. It stopped twice, in fact, first 1 kilometre from the tunnel, and then on the bridge just 300 yards from the hospital. The French press were told this was because Diana's blood pressure was so low. It took over 1 hour and 10 minutes for Diana to reach the hospital, a distance of 3 miles. The inquiry never raised the disturbing question: did this delay almost guarantee Diana would die?
Cette nuit, la princesse de Galles a été victime à Paris d'un accident de la circulation à grande vitesse. Elle a été immédiatement prise en charge par le SAMU de Paris qui a effectué la réanimation initiale. À son arrivée à l'hôpital de la Pitié-Salpêtrière, elle présentait un choc hémorragique gravissime, d'origine thoracique, puis rapidement un arrêt cardiaque. Une thoracotomie d'urgence a mis en évidence une plaie importante de la veine pulmonaire gauche. Malgré la fermeture de cette plaie et un massage cardiaque externe puis interne de 2 heures, aucune efficacité circulatoire n'a pu être rétablie et le décès a été constaté à 4 heures du matin.
Soon after, the paparazzi were arrested, and they became the first guilty party. With the snappers behind bars, the police took no notice of what Patel was saying. He had seen no paparazzi around him or around the Mercedes, but he was surprised to find himself bundled into a van in handcuffs and taken to Paris police headquarters.
Et donc il y a un officiel qui est venu, dont je ne dirai pas le nom, et qui m'a dit simplement qu'il ne valait même pas que je me fasse connaître. Et c'est tout. Il m'a lancé seulement cette menace. Moi je ne savais pas qui c'était à ce moment-là.
The information provided by Patel leads us to believe the official was Chief of Police Massonny. We put this to Mr. Massonny, but he has never responded.
Et puis voilà, ils disent que ça, c'est pas comme ça que ça s'est passé. J'ai compris,
Ils vous disent que c'est pas comme ça que ça s'est passé.
Ouais. Mais ce qu'ils voulaient exactement, ils me l'ont pas dit.
Mais quand il vous disait c'est pas possible, il vous disait, il vous suggérait la façon dont ça avait pu se passer?
Non, comme si j'étais pas là. J'avais jamais rien vu, etc.
That night, the police briefed the press that Patel was lying. Paris Match's chief reporter had the story from Patel's lawyer 3 days later.
Il est arrivé le 3e ou 4e jour et nous avons une longue conversation de 2 heures. Donc j'aurais pu être beaucoup plus actif là-dessus, mais je me méfiais, je ne sais pas pourquoi. Les choses les plus faciles me semblent toujours un peu inquiétantes. C'est vrai, quoi, il faut le dire. Donc voilà, maintenant je sais que Patel... Qu'est-ce que je sais sur Patel? Je sais qu'il est allé dans ce commissariat et je sais qu'il a été interrogé par la brigade criminelle et par qui. Je sais exactement par qui.
By suppressing Patel's evidence, the French could blame the photographers. From early September, Patel's lawyer asked the inquiry to hear his client. They only agreed to do so 7 months later. Then the inquiry asked the police to explain why Patel's original statement had been lost.
Sauf que, effectivement, si elle a été entendue par la police, il devrait y avoir un procès-verbal qui apparemment n'existerait pas, ou en tout cas qui n'aurait pas été produit.
Et ça vous inspire quoi, ça, le fait que...
Ça m'étonne énormément, d'autant que j'ai toujours pensé que, pour diverses raisons, que M. Patel disait la vérité. Alors je ne comprends pas très bien qu'on n'ait jamais pris en compte son témoignage.
The police first claimed Patel was a liar, and second that he didn't speak clearly enough. Yes, there had been a call to the emergency services as Patel claimed, but the caller said he was speaking from Almont-Marceau, not Alma-Marceau. No such place as Almont-Marceau exists. Harrod's head of security had worked at Scotland Yard for 26 years.
My first concern was I'd learned that the bodyguards had decided not to deploy a backup vehicle, a protection vehicle, which was contrary to all of our own rules. That surprised me greatly. I was also very surprised when I learned, particularly from television footage, that the French police had not isolated the tunnel to preserve it for evidence. Whether this was something other than a traffic accident or not, something of this magnitude involving Diana, Princess of Wales, this scene should have been preserved.
These extraordinary images are from that night.
Vers 7 heures du matin, je suis rentré au tunnel. Au tunnel de l'Alma, parce que je voulais voir l'intérieur. Et je croyais, j'étais sûr que c'était toujours fermé, mais c'était complètement ouvert. Et ça m'a beaucoup surpris, hein, parce que c'était Diana, elle était morte, c'était une grande affaire. Et j'aurais pensé que la police aurait fermé le tunnel pendant même plusieurs journées. Mais c'était complètement ouvert vers 7 heures du matin.
Shortly before dawn, the Propriété de Paris, the green vehicles which sweep the streets, sprayed detergent in the tunnel. Not the best way of preserving forensic evidence. Was it a clean-up or a cover-up?
The whole Diana factor does alarm the establishment. She has this volcanic capacity to cause great grief, dismay, lack of logic, distract from the main purpose of the royal family, and certainly an inquest could throw up some uncomfortable questions.
The most famous woman in the world had died.
Happy birthday!
As Diana's body was brought back to Britain, everyone here expected a thorough investigation, like an inquest. But France does not have public inquests. The government appointed a middle-ranking judge, Hervé Stéphan, to carry out an inquiry into what caused the deaths. He worked to rules that haven't changed much since Napoleon.
First of all, you have something which is called the secrecy of the investigation in France. That means that apart from the investigating judge and the parties being really limited to the lawyers and the prosecutor, no one has access to the prosecution, no one has access to the file, no one has access to the evidence. So the media don't know anything, the public does not know anything, and nobody can verify what's in the file.
Over there they have the inquisitorial system where an officer of the state conducts the inquiry with the assistance of the police. And of course all officers of the state are paid by the state and beholden to the state. And one is, shall one say, in no circumstances sceptical as to whether or not there can be interference from above.
The standard accident investigation carried out by French traffic police has never been made public and does not form part of the official report. But Patrick Chauvel, a well-known French photographer, did speak at some length to traffic police who carried out the original investigation.
They made their own investigation, of course, but then they had pressure from the Élysée, who told them to keep it low, you know, and they were not very happy about that because they made their own inquiry and that's their job. So they don't like to be pushed, you know, when they're doing their job honestly.
36 hours after the crash, the French authorities changed their view. It was no longer the fault of the paparazzi, but a drink-driving accident. An explanation they still insist to be true.
Good evening. The Paris prosecutor's office disclosed today that the driver of the car in which Princess Diana was fatally injured had an illegal blood alcohol level. He's said to have been more than 3 times over the French limit and twice the British one. There was also more evidence today about the speed at which the car was traveling when it crashed. A police source said the speedometer was found frozen at more than 120 miles an hour.
Within just over 24 hours of this crash, when it was put out that this was caused by a drunk driver, a person drunk as a pig, driving at 192 kilometres, they were false statements. They were certainly false statements then, and we know they're false statements now. And one of the reasons we know that is that the statement as to the drink drive was put out before Henri Paul's body samples had even been fully analysed. So they didn't have an analysis report of this, and yet it was put out that he was drunk, severely drunk. They also said that the speedometer of the car was stuck at 192 kilometres per hour. That was refuted immediately by Mercedes themselves, who said on impact the speedometer of the car reverts to 0. Now, that's something they had to concede right away.
The files show the inquiry tried to work out the speed of the car. Mercedes were paid to carry out crash tests, although their experts were never allowed to inspect the vehicle. But what is not in the files is another picture, which could have given a quick and clear answer to the speed, as Chauvel heard from the traffic police.
Well, this guide woman was pissed of the pressure, and he said, I'm going to show you something. And if ever this goes bad, maybe I'll forget the photo in my office and you can sort of take it. And it was a photo taken by the flash. There's a camera, it's gone now, at the entrance of that tunnel. And you know those flash pictures when you go over 60 kilometers an hour, which is the speed limit. So the flash is a frontal flash. So you can see the people in the car. You can recognize them. And on that picture you could recognize absolutely everybody in the car. and it says the speed and the date.
And what were the people in the car like?
Well, the driver was normal, if I can say so. I mean, I didn't know his face before. He looks particular. The guy on the right side looks tense. He seems a little bit afraid. Maybe the car's going too fast. And the people in the back are just laughing their heads off, having fun.
We asked Chauvel why that photo had never been released.
When they made their first comment to the press, the official comment was that the flash didn't work at that time. But then somebody found out that the guy who was driving like 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before, in his normal car, got 15 days later his ticket.
The files show the final estimate was that the car crashed at around 65 miles an hour, but that was never published. 2 days after the crash, French police stressed the car's speed and how drunk the driver was, but the evidence for that is poor. These enhanced images are from the Ritz's own video. They show that 30 minutes before the crash, Henri Paul squats and ties his shoelaces. He transfers his weight gracefully from left to right and gets up again without a hitch or stumble. Paul spent 2 hours before setting off from the Ritz in the company of Trevor Rees-Jones.
Did Trevor Rees-Jones have any feeling that Henri Paul was drunk?
No, none whatsoever. He would, in fact, not have permitted in any shape or form anybody he had suspicion of having drunk to drive the car. That was an essential part of his job, to ensure the couple's security.
The autopsy on Henri Paul was carried out by Professor Dominique Leconte and Dr. Gilbert Pépin. They concluded that Henri Paul's blood had 1.74 grams of alcohol, twice the legal limit in Britain. He also had legal medication and an average of 20.7% of carbon monoxide. The carbon monoxide reading is bizarre because such a high level leads to erratic behavior.
Pas possible. Car plus de 20% de monoxyde de carbone, on ne peut pas conduire. On ne peut pas se tenir debout. On vomit. On a mal à la tête. Donc on aurait décelé chez M. Paul un comportement tout à fait anormal. Il n'aurait pas pu prendre la voiture puisque au moins le garde du corps l'aurait empêché de prendre le volant.
The first thing we wanted was an independent post-mortem, and that was denied without reason. They wouldn't give a reason why we couldn't have one. We then asked for an independent analysis of these body samples, and that was denied. We then asked whether we could be present at any subsequent examination of Henri Paul's body, and that was denied. All of these things without reason.
The police got a search warrant for Henri Paul's flat. His friend Garrick had the keys and watched.
J'ai eu quand même la nette impression que le rapport de perquisition était quand même un petit peu orienté. Parce que vous voyez, on a toujours fait on a toujours dit il y a une bouteille de martini dans le frigo alors qu'on ne buvait pas de martini. On disait qu'il y avait des bouteilles de Ricard. Tout d'un coup, il semblait que son bar était extraordinaire alors qu'il était tout à fait commun. J'en ai un moi-même à peu près du même ordre.
Et vous dites que vous sentiez qu'il était orienté parce qu'on cherchait de l'alcool.
Orienté, puisqu'on n'a jamais dit qu'il y avait par exemple 240 bouteilles de Coca-Cola.
Il y avait 240 bouteilles?
Oui, de boîtes de Coca-Cola light, puisque c'était sa boisson préférée. Là, le rapport n'en fait pas état. Pourquoi? Mais j'ai l'impression qu'à partir du moment où on ne voit que l'alcool et on ne voit pas les softs, bon, ça me paraît quand même un peu orienté.
Et les médicaments? Ils ont cherché les médicaments?
Mais forcément.
Et alors?
Et alors, il n'y en avait pas.
Il n'y avait pas de médicaments?
Non plus.
The Paul family were denied access to the material in these bottles, their son's blood and urine samples. Backed by Al Fayed, they got 4 of Europe's top pathologists to examine the post-mortem report. They dissected the autopsy and listed 28 critical errors that made the procedure unreliable. These included that the autopsy was not timed. No proper description was given of how his body was identified. No explanation was given for the 20.7% of carbon monoxide. The final conclusions of the 4 pathologists were damning. The results on carbon monoxide in the blood are inexplicable as the attitude of Dr. Pepin and Professor Leconte, who continue to present arguments which have no rigor and no scientific value to justify their results. The hypothesis that there was a mix-up in the samples needs to be seriously considered. 22 other corpses were in the morgue that night. The Paul family, backed by Al-Fayed, sued the state to obtain their son's samples so they could do a DNA test to check it was really his blood. The French Attorney General took over the case, but so far the family has not succeeded. The judge said privately that the blood was the great mystery of the affair, but he did not probe further. His similar failure to probe Henri Paul's security connections surprised Richard Tomlinson.
I do find it really strange that Judge Stephan didn't really... I mean, I was expecting him to go through in great detail all the details of the file, and I mean, you know, I could have given him enough information for him to have, you know, identified which file it was, and he could have. I mean, it takes a brave magistrate to do it, but he could have, you know, asked for a subpoena of the file through the British government and asked for the file. And there's mechanisms to do that. You could do that.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. You can. Whether MI6 would agree to it, I don't know. But if there was sufficient pressure, then they would have to, yeah.
This was only one of a number of lines of inquiry the French refused to pursue. For Mohammed Al-Fayed, it was a personal tragedy, but it could also have become a business problem. Trevor Rees-Jones's lawyers wanted the inquiry to consider whether the Ritz and the firm that owned the Mercedes Étoile limousine might have been negligent. The Mercedes Diana used had been stolen 3 months earlier and its electronics ripped out. Had the repairs been properly carried out?
We tried to reorientate the investigation on another way, especially towards Étoile Limousine and the Ritz. But by that time, the investigating magistrate and the prosecution wanted to come to an end because there was too much pressure, because no one would know the real truth anyway, so it had to be stopped. So it was stopped, and of course, not everything has been inquired on.
27 volumes of facts, speculation and evidence reveal another enigma. Dodi had his mobile phone that night, and yet astonishingly, when the police logged all the possessions of the victims, they found he had no papers, no lighter, no cigarettes, and certainly no mobile phone. All that was on his body was 1,000 francs.
Did you get the impression that stuff had been found in the car which we were not told about?
Yes, they found stuff in the car, which was not especially unusual. In lots of car accidents you have dope. But the dope was not in the driver's hand, it was in the passenger, so what? But what they didn't like is the pressure. Suddenly the Élysée told them to keep it low.
A high-ranking police source confirmed to us Patrick Chauvel's claims that illegal drugs were found in the car and the existence of the speed camera photo, which has never been produced. Some evidence seems to have gone missing. Some evidence doesn't seem to have been followed up. In the files, we also found this photograph, taken between 20 and 22 minutes past midnight.
There is one picture or two which is obviously taken from before the car. Somebody has to drive before the car to take that picture, especially since you see Trevor Rees-Jones looking into the mirror. But I can't say exactly where that picture was taken. It was obviously taken somewhere in the tunnel, but I can't say if it's in the beginning of the tunnel or in the middle or after some sort of accident or wherever.
But it's taken in the Alma tunnel?
Yes.
So who took this photo? We may never know. 17 days after the crash, The paparazzi were no longer under arrest for manslaughter, but were still charged with failure to help the victims. The inquiry had leaked Henri Paul was drunk. Then another new development, which appeared to explain how the accident happened. The police said they'd found debris from a white Fiat Uno in the tunnel. It was suggested the Fiat was in front of the Mercedes.
The Mercedes wing mirror was found at this point, with traces of another car's paintwork and shards of a Fiat tail light. The Mercedes was thrown into the right-hand wall, then hurled across into the 13th pillar in the middle of the tunnel.
The police started a massive search operation, but only questioned owners of white Fiat Unos in the Paris area. They drew a blank. But Al Fayed's detectives did better and tracked down this Fiat Uno. Its rear tail light had been fixed, and it belonged to a paparazzi.
La princesse. Te voilà bien.
His name was James Anderson. His past was even more mysterious than Henri Paul's. James Anderson made no secret of the fact he had a white Fiat Uno when French television profiled him 3 years ago.
Il y a une très bonne anecdote, car c'est une voiture qui a 325 000 km maintenant. Une année, je fais quelques photos de M. Gianni Agnelli à Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat. Il se baignait sur son bateau, le Capriccia. Je fais quelques photos de lui. Le lendemain, il me reconnaît. Il revient dans le port de Saint-Tropez. Et je lui dis, j'ai à peu près déjà 200 000 km avec, alors que là, j'ai 325 000. Et il me dit, l'artiste, quand tu seras à 500 000 km, je te ferai un cadeau d'une voiture. Moi, je vais vous dire personnellement ce qui m'inquiète énormément aujourd'hui. Il manque 175 000 km et je me demande...
During the summer, Diana had been photographed by James Anderson. He was a paparazzi with political connections at the highest level. He was the official photographer to one French Prime Minister, and friendly enough with another, Lionel Jospin, to share a motorbike with him. Yet French Special Branch was so worried by his history, they'd started to investigate him, as one of their senior officers revealed to us.
Au mois d'août 97, nous avons pu apprendre qu'il avait passé plusieurs jours sur le yacht où se trouvait la princesse et Al Fayed, ce qui franchement n'est pas très normal, n'est pas très courant pour un journaliste. Il était sur le yacht même. Et pas 1 heure, mais il y aurait passé sans doute 2 ou 3 jours. Oui, ce sont des sources fiables.
Richard Tomlinson recalls a figure like Anderson in MI6.
The MI6 have a cadre of people who have their own profession, their own life, they do their own jobs. They can be barristers, they can be all sorts of things, who just happen to have a skill which is occasionally useful to MI6, and they kind of work on a short-term contractual basis for MI6. They had one guy who was a photographer, and his normal job was as a paparazzi photographer, but occasionally he would do work for MI6.
French security services had evidence Anderson was in the Alma Tunnel.
Et il se serait vanté, dans son entourage, quelque temps après, d'avoir même donc photographié et même enregistré, sans doute, les derniers instants, du moins sous le pont de l'Alma, de la princesse Diana. C'est un témoignage qu'on a recueilli dans son entourage.
The widow of one of Anderson's friends confirmed he had boasted to them he was at the scene.
Il m'a dit qu'il y était. Il nous a dit qu'il y était. Je suis vert, oui, il a vu l'accident et tout ça. Il n'a pas été pris par la police. Il est parti parce qu'il était malin.
Vraiment, James Anderson avait de très fortes intuitions. Il avait l'art d'approcher de nombreuses personnalités qui ensuite sont mortes subitement.
French Special Branch became interested in Anderson when they noticed he'd been the last person to photograph and one of the last to talk with Pierre Bérégovoy.
James Anderson pouvait sans doute ne pas travailler seul et être manipulé ou dirigé soit par un service ou des services, soit par une équipe qui, à un certain moment, pouvait être chargée d'éliminer ou de gêner ou de compromettre une personnalité, et Anderson faisait sans doute office d'agent de renseignement. On a évoqué les liens que pouvait avoir Anderson avec des services anglais ou services français. Cela n'a jamais été formellement prouvé, Mais c'est une hypothèse qu'il ne faut pas exclure. Et puis il y a surtout les conditions absolument ahurissantes de sa mort.
In June 2000, Anderson apparently committed suicide by setting fire to himself in his car on this piece of army land. He left no suicide note. His body was found by French commandos. Both friends and even the funeral director are very skeptical that Anderson really killed himself. None of this was ever mentioned by the French inquiry.
Under British law, there has to be an inquest into the death of any British subject who dies abroad in mysterious or unexplained circumstances. Now, that was obviously the case with Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed. But though they died in 1997, no inquest was opened until 2004. The royal coroner then did two things. First, he formally opened the inquest, and second, he asked the ex-commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Britain's top cop, if you like, Lord Stevens, to investigate how the French had investigated the crash. Lord Stevens took a team to Paris. He got access to all kinds of documents which investigators and journalists obviously found it hard to get to. And he said, rather cryptically, that there really was something wrong with the way the French had gone about the investigation.
We've got new witnesses and new forensic evidence.
But then we had another shock in June 2006. By then everybody thought Lord Stevens would soon issue his report, and everybody thought the coroner would finally open the inquest properly. But suddenly the coroner then announced that the inquests into Princess Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed were simply too time-consuming, and he had to resign. So we now find ourselves in the very strange position that there has to be an inquest. The inquest has been opened, but there is nobody to run the inquest.
James Anderson was only one reason why there was pressure not to explore certain irregularities about the accident investigation. The first witness on the scene was ignored and deliberately discredited. A proper traffic accident investigation was apparently suppressed, and the victim's possessions had apparently vanished. The dead driver's autopsy was clearly flawed, yet formed the basis for the main conclusion that drunk driving was to blame. The driver and another key witness had strong Secret Service connections, but these were never explored. To blame the driver, Henri Paul, as the French authorities have done, may be convenient, even politic. But the true causes of the crash are complex and murky. The revelation that Diana predicted she would be the victim of a so-called accident has sparked even more calls for an inquest.
It's third-class treatment for a first-class tragedy. It's very difficult to get to the root of why they have delayed. There are rather feeble excuses like, we're waiting for the French inquiry. Well, the French inquiry is over. There are feeble excuses like, we want to make sure we can get all the witnesses. Well, the same witnesses are there as ever have been there.
We certainly won't see an inquest open in 2006. We probably won't see an inquest open in 2007. And the best guess is that maybe it will open in 2008, 11 years after the crash in the Alma Tunnel.